April 10th, 45, Cherbourg Peninsula, France. The rain here didn't fall. It hung in the air, a cold, gray mist that soaked through wool uniforms and settled into the marrow of the bone. Inside the barbed wire perimeter of the prisoner of war camp, time seemed to have stopped. It was the Tuesday before Easter, a week that in the old world, the world before the war, would have been filled with church bells, family gatherings, and the smell of baking bread. Here, there was only the mud. The mud of Cherbourg was a living thing. It was deep, sucking, and relentless. It coated the boots of the 500 men standing in formation. These men were the remnants of the Wehrmacht. Some were veterans of the Eastern Front, men with eyes like frozen lakes who had seen the horrors of Stalingrad. Others were boys, barely 18, drafted in the desperate final months of the Reich. They stood in silence, shivering not just from the cold, but from a profound, gnawing uncertainty. For months, their universe had been defined by hunger. Not the appetite one feels after missing lunch, but the deep, metabolic starvation that turns men into skeletons and minds into prey. They had lived on watery soup, sawdust, bread, and rumors. Rumors were the only currency left. The war is over. The war will last 10 years. Hitler is dead. Hitler has a secret weapon. We are going to be shot. We are going to be sent to Siberia. But on this morning, the rumors ended. The American guards moved through the camp with a purpose that cut through the lethargy. Their voices were sharp, their boots loud on the wooden walkways. Pack up, everyone out. It wasn't a request. It was an eviction. The prisoners moved with the slow, deliberate motions of men preserving energy. There wasn't much to pack. A battered mess tin, a spoon sharpened on a stone, a few tattered letters from wives who might already be widows, a photograph of a child who would be a year older now. These pathetic bundles were tied with string or wrapped in spare shirts. They were the sum total of a soldier's life after 6 years of war. As they lined up by the main gate, the wind picked up, singing that mournful song through the tent ropes that every prisoner knows by heart. No breakfast was served, no coffee, just the hollow ache in the stomach and the fear of the unknown. When the heavy wooden gates creaked open, revealing the wet road beyond, a ripple of anxiety passed through the ranks. Where were they going? To the east? Back to a ruined Germany? To the south? To work in French coal mines? The column began to march. They walked through a corridor of silence. On either side of the road, American soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder. They didn't jeer, they didn't spit, they didn't cheer. They just watched. Their faces were unreadable, marked by the same exhaustion that plagued the prisoners. It was a strange, silent parade of the defeated passing the victors, both sides united by the weariness of a continent that had forgotten how to live. As they entered the port city of Cherbourg, the French civilians stopped to watch. These were the people who had lived under German occupation for 4 years. The prisoners braced themselves for stones, for curses, for spit. But there was only silence. A woman in a doorway pulled her shawl tighter. An old man spat on the ground, but not at them, just at the world in general. They were ghosts passing through a graveyard of a city. And then the harbor opened up before them. The smell hit them first, a mix of salt, rotting seaweed, bunker oil, and wet iron. Then they saw the ships. 3 massive gray shapes anchored in the slate gray water. They were ugly, functional, and terrifyingly large. The order came down the line, embarkation. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in the chests of the men. The ocean. They were leaving this continent. For a German soldier, the land was home. The land was where you fought, where you marched, where you died. The sea was an alien hostility. Were they going to England? Were they being taken out to the middle of the Atlantic to be dumped? The search began at the dockside. It was humiliating and thorough. American MPs with callous hands patted down every pocket, every seam. The small survival kits the men had built for themselves, the sharpened spoons, the flint lighters, the small tin boxes for tobacco were ripped away and tossed into the harbor. Splash, splash, splash. Each sound was a tiny tragedy. That spoon wasn't just a utensil. It was a tool that had opened apart. 1,000 cans, a piece of metal warmed by a man's hand for 3 years. Now it was gone, sinking into the oily scum of the port. They were being stripped of their last defenses, reduced to nothing but the rags on their backs and the numbers on their paperwork. They were herded toward the middle ship, a towering wall of rusted steel named the Thomas Marshall. It was a Liberty ship, one of the thousands built by American shipyards in mere days. To the German soldiers, used to the handcrafted, over-engineered machinery of the Reich, this ship looked like a floating slab of brutalist industrialism. They walked up the narrow, swaying gangplank. It felt flimsy under their boots. Below, the dark water churned. Ahead, the dark maw of the ship waited. They stepped through the iron hatch, and the daylight vanished. Inside, the Thomas Marshall was a different world. The prisoners expected a dungeon, a dark, wet hold smelling of rats and sickness. What they found was a cavern of organized steel. The hold had been converted into a massive floating barracks. 5-tier bunks, constructed of pipe and canvas, lined the walls from the deck to the ceiling. It looked like a honeycomb made of metal. In the center of the hold stood long wooden tables and benches. The lighting was harsh, electric, yellow, powered by generators that hummed with a deep, vibrating thrum that you felt in your teeth. The air was stale, smelling of ozone and close bodies, but it wasn't the smell of rot. It was the smell of machinery. 500 men shuffled into the space, their boots clanging on the metal deck. They looked at each other with wide eyes. Where were the chains? Where were the cells? This looked less like a prison and more like a dormitory for giants. They claimed their bunks, the old hares. The veterans who had survived the front grabbed the middle bunks, avoiding the floor where vomit might pool and the ceiling where the air was hottest. Helmet, our narrator, found a spot next to his 3 closest comrades. Schultz, a cynic from Berlin whose tongue was sharper than his bayonet. Siegfried, a wiry, nervous man who couldn't sit still. And Hawker, a gentle giant who had been a baker before the war and now served as their unofficial cook. They sat on the canvas stretchers, knees pulled to chests, waiting. The ship groaned around them. The engines kicked into a higher gear, a rhythmic pounding that would become the soundtrack of their lives for the next 2 weeks. Then, around 4 p.m., the static of a loudspeaker cut through the murmur of voices. Achtung! Attention! The voice was distorted, metallic. The prisoners froze. They knew this tone. It was the tone of authority, usually followed by bad news. Your attention is directed to the starboard corner of the hold. All that. 500 heads turned. In the corner, stacked from the deck almost to the overhead pipes, was a mountain of cardboard boxes. It was a fortress of cartons, massive and imposing. Those are crackers, the voice continued. Indifferent and bored. Want. It is free. End quote. You may take as much as you... For a second, nobody moved. The translation didn't make sense. Free? As much as you want? In the camps, men had been stabbed for a potato skin. In the retreat from France, men had eaten boiled shoe leather. The concept of unlimited did not exist in their vocabulary. Then, the dam broke. It wasn't a march. It was a stampede. The hold exploded into movement. Men jumped from the top bunks. They scrambled over tables. The discipline of the Wehrmacht dissolved in the face of raw animal hunger. They hit the pile of boxes like a wave. Hands tore at cardboard. Wax paper was ripped open. And then the sound of crunching. Hundreds of men shoving dry, salty crackers into their mouths by the handful. They didn't chew, they inhaled. Some men filled their pockets. Others filled their shirts, looking like lumpy, gray scarecrows. They carried towers of boxes back to their bunks, guarding them with wild eyes. It was a scene of madness. It was pathetic, and it was terrifying. It was the total collapse of dignity in the face of starvation. Then, the hatch opened. An American officer descended the stairs, flanked by 2 guards. He didn't have a weapon drawn. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, watching the feeding frenzy. With a look of mild confusion, perhaps even pity, he raised a hand. Slowly, the noise died down. The chewing stopped. 500 pairs of eyes watched him, waiting for the punishment. They had stolen the food. They had lost control. Now came the retribution. The officer spoke to the interpreter, who shouted the translation. "Gentlemen," the officer said, "enough for everyone. And if you are Watts, there is no need to fight. This is not the only food. There is, He paused, letting the words sink in. "The galley is operational. We have stores for the entire voyage. No one on this ship needs to be hungry. You will be fed 3 times a day. The crackers are just extra." And now the silence that followed was heavier than the ship's keel. Enough for everyone. It was a sentence that destroyed the Nazi propaganda they had been fed for years. They had been told the Americans were weak, that their supply lines were stretched, that they were suffering just like Germany. But here, on a simple troop transport, there was so much food that they gave it away as a snack. From the back of the room, a single clap rang out. Then another, then a whistle. And suddenly, the hold of the Thomas Marshall was filled with applause. They weren't cheering for the officer. They weren't cheering for America. They were cheering for the end of the hunger. They were clapping because for the first time in 1945, they realized they were going to live. That evening, the first hot meal was served. Hawker, who had volunteered for kitchen duty, stood at the serving line with a ladle. When Helmut reached the front, he stared at the metal tray. It wasn't watery cabbage soup. It was a thick stew, rich with fat and vegetables. There was a slab of meat. There was white bread, not the gray, sawdust-filled war bread of Germany, but soft, white American bread. And coffee. Real coffee. Smelling of roasted beans. Not the bitter, chicory substitute they were used to. They ate in a kind of religious trance. Men went back for seconds, then thirds. Some ate until they were physically sick, their shrunken stomachs unable to handle the sudden abundance. They lay on their bunks, groaning, holding their bellies, smiling at the ceiling. "They are fattening us up," Schultz muttered, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. "Witch in Hansel and Gretel. They want us plump before they eat us, like the back." Siegfried laughed, a high, nervous sound. "Let them eat me," he said. "At least I'll die full." Helmut looked at the rivets in the steel wall. "It's the logistics," he said quietly. "Think about it. If they can waste this much food on prisoners, what do they have for their own soldiers? What do they have for their tanks?" The realization hung in the air. Germany had lost the war not just on the battlefield, but on the assembly line. They had been defeated by boxes of crackers. That night, the ship shuddered. The engines deepened their pitch to a low, powerful growl. The Thomas Marshall slipped its moorings and moved out of the harbor. Helmut lay in the darkness, listening to the breathing of 500 men. He felt the ship roll slightly. Europe was receding, the ruins of Cologne, the ashes of Berlin, the graves of his friends. It was all behind him now. Ahead lay only the dark Atlantic and the mystery of America. For the first few days, the voyage was almost a vacation. The convoy formed up off the coast of England, a massive armada of ships stretching to the horizon. Destroyers, frigates, troop, transports, tankers. It was a display of maritime power that stunned the German soldiers. They were used to the U-boat wolf packs hunting alone. This was a herd of elephants marching across the sea. Routine settled in, morning roll call, breakfast eggs, powdered, but eggs nonetheless. Deck, time. Lunch, nap, dinner, sleep. For Helmut, Schultz, Siegfried, and Hawker, the deck time was the highlight. They would stand by the railing, wrapped in their gray greatcoats, watching the sea. "Where are the red crosses?" Schultz asked one morning, scanning the hull of the ship. "What do you mean?" Helmut asked. "We are a prisoner transport," Schultz said, gesturing around. "By the Geneva Convention, we should be marked. Red crosses on the deck, red crosses on the side, to tell the U-boats not to shoot." They looked at the gray steel. There were no markings. "To a U-boat commander," Schultz said grimly, "infantry heading to the front. We are a target. We look exactly like a division of American formers." The irony was bitter. They had survived the Red Army, the American airstrikes, and the starvation of the camps, only to face the possibility of being torpedoed by their own navy. Every time a whitecap broke the water, eyes darted toward it, expecting the white trail of a torpedo. But the ocean had other plans. It wasn't the Germans who would attack them, it was the Atlantic itself. On the fourth day, the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. The wind shifted, coming from the north, with a howl that drowned out the engines. The convoy began to disperse, each ship fighting for its own survival. The storm hit with the force of a train collision. The Thomas Marshall was a cargo ship, flat-bottomed and cork-like. It didn't cut through the waves. It rode over them, pitching and rolling in a sickening corkscrew motion. Inside the hold, hell broke loose. Gravity became a weapon. One moment, the floor was down. The next, it was tilted at a mate 45-degree angle. Mess kits slid across tables. Men were thrown from their bunks. The air turned foul within minutes. Seasickness is not just nausea. It is a total shutting down of the human spirit. 500 men, trapped in a steel box, heaving their magnificent American meals onto the floor, into buckets, into helmets. The smell was indescribable, a mix of bile, diesel fumes, and unwashed bodies. The guards vanished. They were topside, hanging over the rails, just as sick as the prisoners. The distinctions of war evaporated. There were no Nazis or Americans now. There were only wretched creatures trying not to vomit. Helmet lay on his bunk, gripping the metal bar until his knuckles turned white. He watched a metal trash can slide back and forth across the hold, banging against the bunks with a rhythmic, maddening C-L-A-N-G, slide C-L-A-N-G. Schultz, usually so talkative, was a pale ghost wrapped in a blanket, moaning softly. "Just shoot." "Me?" he whispered. "Tell the Americans I tried to escape and let them shoot me." At 3 a.m., the ship fell. It wasn't a roll. It was a drop. The bow had climbed a rogue wave, hung in the air for a sickening second, and then slammed down into the trough. The sound was like a cannon shot steel, impacting water with millions of tons of force. Boom! The entire ship shuddered. Dust fell from the ventilation pipes. The lights flickered and died, plunging the hold into absolute darkness. Screams erupted. "Torpedo! We're hit! We're sinking!" Men scrambled in the dark. They crashed into tables. They clawed for the stairs. Panic, blind, and primal took over. They were rats in a sinking cage. Helmet felt a boot kick his face. He heard the screech of metal on metal. He thought of the freezing water rushing in, the crushing weight of the ocean. Then, the emergency lights flickered on a dim red glow that made everyone look like demons, and the loudspeaker crackled to life. "Stay in your bunks, stay in your bunks. No damage, just a wave." No reason for excitement. And, no reason for excitement. The absurdity of the phrase hung in the red air. Men were hyperventilating, clutching their life. Jackets crying for their mothers. But the water didn't come. The floor was still dry. The engines were still beating that steady, rhythmic drum. Slowly, the panic receded, replaced by a deep, exhausted shame. They climbed back into their bunks. They wiped the sweat from their faces. They realized they were still alive. The storm raged for another 2 days, but the fear had broken. They had survived the worst. When the sun finally broke through, the ocean transformed again. It became a glittering, endless blue plain, calm and indifferent to their suffering. The men emerged onto the deck like survivors of a shipwreck. They were pale, unshaven, and weak, but the fresh air was like wine. And then the icebergs appeared. "Look!" cried a young soldier from Bavaria. "To the starboard!" Floating in the water were massive white shapes. In the bright sun, they looked like glaciers, drifting south. "Icebergs?" Siegfried asked, squinting. "In April, this far south?" The men crowded the rail. The boredom of the voyage made anything an event. Arguments broke out. "It's the Titanic's graveyard," one man shouted. "No, it's a secret American weather station," said another. Helmet looked closer. He saw something moving on one of the white masses. He nudged. "Hawker, hey," he whispered. "Watch this." He pointed dramatically. "Look, my God, look, a polar bear." "Where? Where?" "Right there, climbing the side. And she has 2 cubs," Helmet shouted, committing to the lie. Hawker joined in. "I see them. One is sliding down into the water." 500 men strained their eyes. "Moving? The poor beasts." "I see it," someone shouted. Yes, the white spot For 5 minutes, the entire prisoner detachment watched imaginary polar bears on a drifting piece of ice. When the ship finally got close enough, the truth revealed itself. It wasn't ice. It wasn't a glacier. It was styrofoam and packing crates, debris from a cargo ship, perhaps one that had been torpedoed or perhaps just trash dumped overboard. The White Mountains were just garbage, bobbing in the swell. When the realization hit, the men didn't get angry. They laughed. They laughed until they cried. They laughed at their own desperation for entertainment, at their collective hallucination. It was the laughter of men who had forgotten how to be lighthearted. For a moment, they weren't prisoners of war. They were just boys on a boat pointing at trash and seeing monsters. As the voyage entered its second week, a quiet change came over the ship. The news came over the radio, filtered down through the guards, to the galley workers, and then to the bunks. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was dead. The news shocked the Germans. In the Reich, leaders were gods. They didn't just die of strokes. They fell in battle or ruled forever. The death of the American president felt like a seismic shift. Does this mean the war ends? Siegfried asked. No, Dr. Braun, the philosophy professor, said quietly. In a democracy, the man dies, but democracy, the man dies. Machine continues. That is the difference. If Hitler dies, the party collapses. If Roosevelt dies, the vice president steps in and the ships keep sailing. It was another lesson in the power of the enemy. The system was stronger than the individual. And then, on the 14th day, the smell of the air changed. It wasn't the salt of the deep ocean anymore. It smelled of earth, of smoke, of industry. The morning mist was thick, obscuring the horizon. But slowly, the sun burned it away. Helmut and his friend stood at the bow, watching the gray curtain lift. First, they saw the water change color from deep blue to a murky brownish green, the Hudson River outflow. Then, they saw the ships. Not the gray warships of the convoy, but tugboats, barges, ferries, civilian traffic. Busy, noisy, colorful. And then, the curtain lifted completely. A collective gasp went up from the deck. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated awe. Rising out of the water was a city of cliffs, towers of stone and glass that climbed impossibly high into the sky, piercing the clouds, the Manhattan skyline. To men who had spent the last 5 years seeing cities reduced to rubble, seeing Hamburg and Berlin flattened by bombs, this was a vision from another planet. This was a city that had never known a blackout. A city that had never heard an air raid siren. It stood arrogant, gleaming, and untouched. My God, Schultz whispered, they built mountains. Why? Siegfried asked, his mouth open. Why build so high? Because, Schultz said, a strange smile on his face, conquer the sky. They ran out of land, so they decided to cross. And there, standing in the harbor, was the woman, the green giantess holding a torch, the Statue of Liberty. Every German knew the image. It was in the propaganda cartoons, usually depicted as a monster or a hypocrite. But seeing her in reality, standing guard over the harbor, silent and majestic, stopped the cynicism in their throats. They looked down at themselves. Their uniforms were stained with grease and salt. Their boots were cracked leather. They were the master race, the soldiers of the 1,000-year Reich. And here they were, arriving in the capital of the world, not as conquerors, but as beggars, as prisoners. The Thomas Marshall slowed, its engines throbbing gently now. Tugboats nudged it toward the pier. The journey was over. The hunger, the storm, the fear of the U-boats, it was all behind them. Helmut looked at the skyline one last time. He thought of the cracker mountain in the hold. He thought of the thick stew. He thought of the officer who said, "There is enough for everyone." He realized then that the war had been lost long before the first shot was fired. You cannot fight. A nation that builds skyscrapers while you are building bunkers. You cannot fight a nation that treats prisoners better than you treat your own soldiers. The gangplank was lowered. The American guards gestured for them to move. "Let's go," Hawker said, picking up his small bundle. Helmut nodded. He took a deep breath of the American air, smelling of gasoline, seawater, and something else. Something that smelled like the future. They walked down the ramp, leaving the ship behind. They were stepping onto the soil of the enemy. They were prisoners of war. They had no idea when they would see Germany again, or what kind of Germany would be left to see. But as Helmut stepped onto the concrete of the New York pier, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was alive. He had survived the Atlantic. And for the first time in 6 years, he wasn't afraid of tomorrow.